Good morning, everybody. My name is Tim O'Brien. I'm the Senior Executive Editor of Bloomberg Opinion, and this is Bloomberg Opinion's Politics live stream for Tuesday morning. I'm joined today by two of my colleagues and friends, Mary Ellen Kloss, who covers politics for us, and Mark Gongloff, who covers the climate crisis. And we're here to discuss the intersection of hurricanes, human misery, climate change, politics, and disinformation. Not surprisingly, all of this has landed in the lap of conversations about the role the federal government plays in providing disaster relief, the role Donald Trump plays in clouding people's minds and spreading disinformation, and what communities across the country have to think about as warming seas and more violent weather change the conditions everyone's used to living with on their own front doorsteps. So let's get into it. We'll be taking questions from our audience this morning. Our colleague, Mary Newman, who produces the show, will post those, and we'll try to get to as many of those as we can. So as we begin this discussion, Hurricane Milton is chugging across the Gulf of Mexico towards central Florida. It's going to hit the coast of Florida, which has already been ravaged by Hurricane Helene. It's expected, it's weakened somewhat according to overnight reports, but there has been talk of it still being a Category 5 hurricane that is expected to carve a path across central Florida on its way to the Atlantic. It may be the first time that Tampa has been hit directly by a hurricane since 1921. And we'll discuss all of the ramifications of that. Mark, you cover climate change with great authority and depth, and you recently wrote that Hurricane Helene is a reminder of the fact that there really are no safe havens anymore from climate change. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, this hurricane is taking aim right at the Florida coast, and the Florida coast is what we always think of as when we think of the sort of front lines of climate change. We think of them, we think of maybe Arizona, we think of the California wildfire zones. One of the scary things about what happened with Helene was not only did it hammer the Florida coast as you would expect, it carried right on up into the Appalachian Mountains and had softened up that area previously with a bunch of rain, and then it delivered even more rain. And this has happened before. I mean, I lived through Hurricane Hugo in 1989 in South Carolina, which plowed through Charleston, went all the way up to Ohio. The difference now is that the superheated water that Hurricane Helene went over in the Gulf of Mexico, and then the warmer than usual air, the combination of that means that every storm it gets much more intense very quickly, and then it delivers a lot more water when it does hit. And so, Asheville, North Carolina got a flood like it hadn't seen in 100 years. So you would think, well, maybe that's a 100-year flood, but these floods are going to happen much more frequently because of climate change, because of storms like this. And that means places like Asheville, which I would have considered a climate haven, and a lot of people did before this storm turned out not to be.
It's a mountain town.
Yeah, it's 300 miles from the ocean. You would not expect a major hurricane effect from in a place 300 miles from the ocean, 2,000 feet above sea level. Didn't matter. So much rain dumped in biblical floods that it just wiped houses, lifted houses from their foundations, and just created an incredible disaster.
Well, Mark, also historically, a lot of the damage that came with hurricanes in previous eras was wind damage, and the modern eras had to get used to the fact that actually the winds are just the start of it, and a lot of the destruction comes from water, and largely through flooding or sort of epic tidal moves on the seas.
Yeah, I mean, ironically, when we talk about categories of hurricanes, we're purely talking about winds. And so this storm, Milton, might hit Tampa Bay or that area, or hopefully south of that. But I mean, nowhere is going to be good. But it may hit as just a Category 3 storm, but no one should be mistaken that means it is going to be any less destructive. The winds may be a little bit lower, but they are still enough to do incredible damage to places that aren't prepared for it. Florida has prepared. A lot of houses there have prepared for that. What you cannot possibly be prepared for is a storm surge of 5, 6, 10, 20 feet. Hopefully we will not see that in the Tampa Bay area. If the track goes to the south, we may not see that, but we will still see a very large storm surge just less than 2 weeks after we got a similar surge from Helene. And that is incredibly damaging. And there's no escape from that. You can't build a house to withstand, water going up to its eaves.
I want to come back to some of the mechanics of all that, Mark. But Mary Ellen, I want to play a clip of Donald Trump talking about the federal relief efforts, frankly, lying about the federal relief efforts in the South. And then we'll come back and discuss that.
I mean, this hurricane has been a bad one. Kamala Harris has left them stranded. This is the worst response to a storm or a catastrophe or a hurricane that we've ever seen, ever. Probably worse than Katrina, and that's hard to beat, right? Worse than Katrina. They didn't do too good a job either, but this is worse. And she sends their money to foreign nations. He and she, they send hundreds of billions of dollars. They send hundreds of billions of dollars to foreign nations. And you know what they're giving our people? $750. 700. Here, Tyson. This is the worst response, I think. Troy, what do you think? The worst? Never.
It's great to have an ivermectin ad up on the screen as Trump scrolls through that stuff, Mary Ellen. There's a lot to unpack here. I think when any community is hit by a humanitarian crisis as severe as this, people want to come together with their neighbors, and they look to the federal government for a helping hand, and state governments. And traditionally, people try to put partisan divides aside in order to just focus on what communities and people and families need. But that is not Donald Trump, and that's certainly not Donald Trump in this moment. We can tick through this, but families aren't only getting $750. That's just table stakes. That's initial aid FEMA provides to families. Families can get as much as, I think, $42,500 if they need it. Money hasn't been diverted from FEMA into spending overseas, or as Trump has claimed, spending on housing for migrants. I think around $36 billion was appropriated for FEMA by Congress in 2024, and it's dedicated to disaster relief. And on and on. I would note that when Trump talks about the Katrina rescue effort being so poorly orchestrated by the federal government, that was actually during a Republican administration. But putting that aside, both Republicans and Democrats in states hit by Helene have said that they're grateful and happy about the federal government's response here. So tell me what you think about what Trump is up to, Mary Ellen, and the impact that it's having on efforts to really address people's needs.
Well, Trump is doing what he's been doing this entire campaign, and that is to dismantle our institutions and trust in them. And with this, he's just undermining, I think, all the very hardworking first responders and people who are on the ground, rescuing people. The extent of his lies, first of all, just undermining or, and undervaluing what FEMA is doing is breathtakingly dishonest. And I think it has the potential to actually frighten some people that are paying attention. Now, it's very likely that those in harm's way and many people who are, victims of Helene aren't tapped in and listening to him. But honestly, I think there is some concern among first responders that I've heard from, and that is that there are people who fear the federal government might be doing things like taking their property if they file a claim. It's patently untrue. It is dangerously, it has the potential to continue to erode trust and confidence. And it is just shameful that he's doing this. I have covered hurricanes since Hurricane Andrew in 1992. And there has always been an kind of an agreement that you set aside politics in the midst of a natural disaster. And for some reason, Trump has decided that that is no longer going to be his approach. He obviously didn't handle natural disasters well when he was president. But I think the thing that I find especially troubling is that his supporters are continuing to sort of repeat these false claims, and that's just terrible.
Did you think there's any cost or price to be paid here, Mary Ellen, for indulging in the worst and most poisonous form of propaganda and lying, or is this just par for the course?
I would hope so. But I have talked to enough Trump supporters that they don't even hear what he says anymore, and it doesn't even resonate with them. I was at an event in Georgia just last night with the former U.S. Senator Kelly Loeffler, and she was repeating Trump's claim about how FEMA will only, she was visiting with farmers in Valdosta who had just lost all their pecan and walnut crop. And she's saying, and FEMA's only going to give them $750, which is, as you mentioned, that is for basic needs. And that's just the start. That doesn't even, there is so much more available federal money to help people. And she fails to mention that it was after Hurricane Michael that farmers in Georgia had to sue the Trump administration because they were not given the disaster aid money that they were entitled to. So, the repetition of these falsehoods just continues to, it's basically turning a disaster into another disaster.
It's also had the magical effect of changing the conversation from Trump's last big lie about migrant families in Springfield, Ohio, kidnapping pets and eating them for dinner, which sort of, focused the mind on the ease and brutality with which he indulges these kinds of falsehoods and lies. But it's now been, that conversation has been changed by what he's now saying about hurricane relief. Mark, speaking of hurricane relief, it's always interesting to me that in these moments when people need help, they look to the government, even though in other times, in calmer times, they bemoan the government as a suffocating presence or a bureaucratic roadblock or a waste of their taxpayer dollars. But when things like this land, and they land with this kind of viciousness, it's hard for states on their own to deal with things like this. And it does demonstrate the kind of awesome organization, force, and spending the federal government can bring to communities when it's needed, isn't it?
For sure. Although, again, to Mary Ellen's point, this is being weaponized in this election season. Ron DeSantis refused to take Kamala Harris's call to talk about hurricane relief, which is so, he is demonstrating to his citizens, I don't necessarily need the help from the federal government, although, of course, Florida really, really does. I mean, it's still cleaning up from Helene, and that requires federal aid by itself. And then it's about to be smacked with perhaps potentially an even bigger storm. Florida cannot handle it on its own. This other part of this is that if Donald Trump takes the White House, he has plans, according to Project 2025, to privatize the National Weather Service. The National Weather Service is providing life-saving information. This is the federal government, scientists providing life-saving information to people throughout this and every other storm that we've had. There are plenty of good private forecasters, I suppose, but this opens the door to all kinds of shenanigans, to political, favoritism, to cronyism, to all kinds of things, and further weakens people's faith in the federal government's ability to deliver these kinds of services to them, all in the name of, serving Donald Trump's desire to be elected and his movement's desire to strip the federal government down to the bone so that it can't provide these services, as we have already seen during COVID. Talking about ivermectin, that's a helpful reminder of how horrible things were in 2020, which we, to Mary Ellen, as Mary Ellen pointed out, we've all seemed to have forgotten. But hurricanes like this do remind us of the importance of what the government can do for us.
And the danger of trying to live in a fact-free zone, whether it's a
Yeah.
public health crisis or a climate crisis. Mark, shifting off of the role the federal government plays in this, individuals are going to have to get used to a changed world too, in terms of how they need to think about climate change and the climate crisis and how they're going to have to adapt to that. Let's talk specifically about hurricanes and all of the issues that have arisen around flooding, coastal living, and flood insurance. Talk a little bit about whether or not most families and communities are prepared for that.
They are not, is the short answer. The slightly longer answer is, one of the eye-opening things after Helene was to find out that so few people in the path of Helene had flood insurance. I mean, the flooding was vast and total in Asheville, North Carolina. In that county, 0.7% of families had federal flood insurance. That is the primary provider. The federal government, again, is the primary provider of flood insurance in the country. 4% of people in the country have it. Vastly more than that need it, and they may not know they need it, or they may believe, well, it only floods. You hear 1,000-year floods. You may think, well, it's been 1,000 years since the last flood. I don't have to worry about it. You do need to worry about it. As FEMA points out, an inch of water in your house can do $25,000 in damage. And if you don't have that, you may have to apply to FEMA for relief, but insurance would help make that process much easier and maybe more lucrative. The other thing is, where people are living. People have been moving into Florida. People have been moving. Fort Myers, Florida, which is directly in the path of Hurricane Milton and was hit by Hurricane Ian just 2 years ago, was one of the fastest growing places in the country. People are moving into Phoenix, Arizona, which is has just had its hottest summer ever in a very hot place ordinarily and is running out of water. People keep moving to these places because they're cheaper. But the problem is that eventually in Florida, it's already starting to happen. Insurance rates are rising. They're being chased out of their homes. On the margins in Florida, people are starting to finally realize maybe I shouldn't live here anymore. And I think more people need to take those kinds of climate change into consideration when they consider whether they're going to move to, say, the Gulf Coast of Florida or a booming suburb of Phoenix that doesn't have any water. Maybe, look for some alternatives. That's another thing. And the final thing is just to remember, there are no safe havens. Vermont was supposed to be a safe haven, but it's flooded a couple of times in the past couple of years from massive just rainstorms. And so you need to have a personal plan in place for what you're going to do, no matter where you are. Is your house prepared for any manner of disasters? It doesn't have to be a thing you walk around in fear about, but just make sure that you're prepared for the worst thing to happen.
Can I
Mary
just add
Ellen, two of the states that.
Oh, go ahead.
Pardon me?
I was just going to add one thing, and that is that in many ways, there's government in some of these states is very complicit in this decision to allow development and growth. I've covered Florida for decades, and honestly, that is one of the things that makes me so angry, is that they just have hurricane amnesia. After everything's cleaned up and people still have blue tarps on their roofs, they move on. And there has been no effort to restrict development or impose any kind of limitation in these very dangerous zones and coastal zones. They finally took, after decades, they finally required a building code that matched the building code of South Florida and applied it to the rest of the state. But it took more than 12 years after Hurricane Andrew. So in many ways, these governments are not responsive to the crises either. And it's because people are allowing people to continue to be reelected without any punishment for their absence of responsible, governing.
That's a great point.
And there's also
money
sort of
involved.
a pell-mell rush, to just continue developing in spite of the disasters we're witnessing. The Florida insurance market is a mess. If you're a homeowner in Florida, getting insured is a challenge. Getting insured affordably is almost impossible for many families. Do you think? Do you expect, Mary Ellen, to see any kind of a change of perspective in states like Florida, or is the money to be made from developing coastlines and bringing more taxpayers into a state just too rich of a target for anyone to resist?
This is a very good question. I have very little optimism that the things that need to change will change, and that is because when we watched after Hurricane Ian decimated some working class, poor areas of Florida, what did we see return? We see high rises that will be built, very to withstand wind damage, and likely, with a first floor that's 20 feet above level, ground level, and then only owned by people who can afford, $1 million condos. That is how the development industry works. They basically look at a hurricane as an opportunity to get, a clear out. Let's clean out an area and we'll come right back in. But as you said, the limiting market factor is, will these places be insured? And I think maybe market forces will start imposing some limits, but I just am not optimistic.
Mark, one of our viewers asked, why do you think people are reelecting government officials who don't respond well to disasters? Is it because of the rampant misinformation?
Well, I mean, I am not necessarily a political expert, but misinformation is rampant and growing worse. People live in bubbles now of information and misinformation. There is no agreed upon reality that we live in anymore as a country, and we've politicized these issues. I mean, conservative Republicans are increasingly reverting to sort of paleo climate denialism. You see it in polls all the time. For a while there, everybody was sort of trending together into believing that climate change was real and human caused, and we could try to fix it. During the era of Donald Trump, those numbers have started to widen again. More than a third, I think, of conservative Republicans don't believe climate change is happening at all, and he fuels that denialism every day. And so it becomes a political thing, just like COVID, talking about climate change, talking about resilience. You have to couch that language in ways to not trigger some of your voters to just turn against you just purely out of tribalism.
I want to
as far as I can tell.
I'll just put a little endpoint anecdote to that. When Ron DeSantis was running for president, he made sure that they passed legislation that would remove the words climate change from all Florida regulation. It was an ovation to the fossil fuel industry, whose contributions he really wanted. So that's where Florida is. We have a ban on the word climate change in Florida statutes.
And so what's the word you use? Chicken soup?
Yeah. Yeah, it's absurd.
Apple pie?
Yeah.
Yeah. Mary Ellen, you recently wrote about North Carolina's efforts to recover from Helene and the impact that might have on the 2024 election. Many states have been hit by these hurricanes, but most recently North Carolina and Georgia, along with others, but those are two very marquee swing states. And what are your thoughts about the kind of impact this might have on voter turnout, or people's thinking about the government, or people's thinking about both presidential candidates?
We've had hurricanes. October is often a very active hurricane season. So we've had hurricanes hit before presidential elections in the past. And it takes an enormous effort to sort of get people to be able to get to the polls. So there needs to be flexibility. And the interesting thing is that, we had flexibility during COVID, and that's how we responded to another disaster in the making. And yet that was used as the vehicle for Donald Trump to claim fraud all over the place. So when there is, flexibility, that opens the door to more misinformation. So this is the dicey issue here. However, there are things that I think North Carolina is moving in the right direction. Their election board just approved some new rules that will make it easier for people to go to the early polling sites, for example. There needs to be that kind of opportunity for people to vote. They often don't have their IDs. They don't have internet connection. They don't have electricity and power still. It should not be the time when people are disenfranchised. And that is, as I was saying, a disaster after a disaster. But it is so difficult when people have, struggling to just repair their homes or even and have lost their livelihoods in many ways, for them to think about voting. But obviously it's very important, especially this election cycle.
Mark, our thoughts are with the residents of Greater Tampa, Greater Orlando, and across Central Florida as Milton makes its way to the state. You've been covering this topic for a while now, and it takes a lot of patience, I think, and fortitude to stick with it in the face of the kind of denialism that Mary Ellen has just been talking about so eloquently. When you're looking forward amid all of this, what are some of the ahas or things on your radar that are focusing your mind, even in the wake of Milton, which we hope spares Florida some of the disaster it seems to be about to visit upon it?
Well, there are two big things. First of all, the Yale program on climate communication just recently released new data on surveys they are always doing about people's attitudes about climate change, and they ask people, they give people a list of reasons to fight climate change, and they ask people to rank them, and weirdly, at the top of the list is always making a better future for our children and grandchildren, which feels very pie in the sky and doesn't seem to jive with how we act, because we don't really vote on, way into the future kind of concerns. But the second thing on that list was very high and has skyrocketed in the past 10 years or so, is avoiding horrible disasters, and so avoiding extreme weather. So it is there. This is evidence, and I think we were seeing it a little bit in other polls too, that this stuff, when you get smacked in the face with these events again and again and again, it finally does sort of wake people up a little bit to, maybe something is different here. And people are anecdotally saying, the weather is just a little bit different. Jeff Vandermeer, this great author, wrote in the New York Times about he's a Tallahassee native, and he wrote about going to Greenville to escape from Helene and arriving in Greenville and realizing he was in the middle of another disaster. People keep doing that; they keep having to move and relocate and evacuate, and they're seeing wildfire smoke from Canada, making it difficult to breathe in New York City. And so these things are starting to sink, I think, into the psyche of people. And I think that will have some effect. I have to believe that, because otherwise you can't be optimistic about this at all. And so that may start to turn up. It is starting to influence how people vote, and maybe not, again, sort of the extreme right wing conservatives, but everybody else, independents, they're starting to think about this stuff more and more. The other thing is the very fast pace of green energy and renewables and electrification that is happening. We just had Climate Week here in New York, and a lot of the speakers talked about we're in the early stages of what could be what the tech wonks call an S curve in growth. An S curve is when things tutor along, putter along for a little while along a flat line and then suddenly shoot up and a hockey stick, sort of like climate change itself. But also, green spending sort of seems to be on that trajectory too. And it then becomes this sort of self-reinforcing thing where people on Wall Street and CEOs realize, oh, I can make money on this, and I can actually save money by doing this, and it just becomes a sort of self-reinforcing cycle, benevolent cycle. And I think hopefully we are in the early stages of that. So those two things do give me optimism, even in the face of these things. But these disasters are also reminders that the climate emergency is not a thing for our children or grandchildren. It is something that is happening to us right this second as we speak.
Mary Ellen, concluding thoughts, and then we'll have to sign off.
No, I think Mark is right, that it's going to take people realizing themselves that this is a change. And I think, the irony for me is that I know so many people who've moved or have decided to, pick the Western North Carolina and the beautiful mountains of North Carolina as their climate haven. And believe it or not, there were exponentially large number of climate scientists based in Asheville. And now we know that, as Mark wisely has written, there are no climate havens, and it's going to take everybody everywhere to start changing our behavior. And we have to hold our elected officials accountable to make sure that they do it as well and they make it possible.
We're out of time for today. Mary Ellen Kloss, Mark Gongloff, you're both columnists for Bloomberg Opinion. I'm Tim O'Brien. I'm the Senior Executive Editor of Bloomberg Opinion. Thank you for joining us. We'll be back again next week.